Good morning, everyone. It's Easter weekend, so I can think of no better topic to address today than England's history with Ireland and the Irish independence movement leading up to the Easter Rising of 1916, which kicked off the formal Irish Revolutionary period. It is possible for me to talk about this all day. And of course, William Butler Yeats is hands down my favorite poet that we'll study this semester. I'm going to try my best to keep this intentionally brief. I may have already failed, but let's get going. First, the history of England and Ireland. Prior to the 12th century, Ireland was ruled by the Gaelic people. Gaelic Ireland was an island of tribes and small kingdoms, all with their own individual monarchs, all of whom were vying for title of High King. There was no centralized government, there was no centralized rule. The history of Gaelic Ireland is very Game of Thrones. There was even a king of the north. At the end of the 12th century, the Normans invaded, led by King Henry II. King Henry II invaded Ireland because the Pope told him to. Pope Adrian IV signed off on Henry's invasion of Ireland because he believed that any land that Christianity became aware of belonged to Christ. Henry II was responsible for building towns, establishing serfdom. He introduced Catholicism, and he set up a proxy seat of government in Dublin. Despite the conquering of Ireland, British sway over the island began to decline in the centuries that followed for a number of reasons, some of which included invasion from Edward the Bruce of Scotland, the Black Death Plague, and the preoccupation of Britain in military conflicts like the 100 Years' War and the War of the Roses, which was, so for a while, Britain just had its mind on other things, and Ireland slowly began to recede back into its old ways, with its lords and kings and its tribalism. In the 16th century, the Tudors invade Ireland. Henry VIII invaded the island in response to the Kildare Rebellion, led by a man named Silken Thomas Fitzgerald. Henry VIII's invasion of Ireland basically had two long-lasting effects. One, it created the Kingdom of Ireland, which would be ruled by the King of England. As such, Ireland was ruled first through martial law and then through immigration. Henry VIII began to confiscate all the land of Ireland, and then throughout the centuries that followed would mete it out back to loyal British subjects who were living there. The other thing of consequence was that Henry VIII separated from the Catholic Church because he wanted to get a divorce from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and in doing so both founded the Anglican Church and made it the official recognized religion of the land, and it alienated all the Catholics. In the middle of the 17th century, Britain would experience a series of civil wars between a faction that was loyal to the royals and to Charles I, and a faction that was loyal to Parliament and Oliver Cromwell. Part of the overall conflict involved the Irish Confederate Wars between 1641 and 1653. This was more a civil war in Ireland between the Catholic majority and the minority ruling class of British Protestants. Irish were defeated by Cromwell, about 250,000 Irish civilians died, and England enacted what became known as the Penal Laws in 1650, which resulted in the utter disenfranchisement of Catholics and Protestant dissenters in Ireland. Catholics were not allowed to hold office, they were not allowed to join the clergy, they were not allowed to vote, mixed marriages between the religions was banned, and this kicked off a period known as the Protestant Ascendancy. Protestant Ascendancy is basically a term that describes the period of time where Ireland saw an influx of people from Britain coming to Ireland and being given land that had been confiscated by Henry VIII to the English subjects who moved there. This would ultimately create a kind of English-Irish apartheid, where a small number of Protestants had pretty much all the political power over the majority Catholic population of Ireland. After the death of Oliver Cromwell and the restoration of the British monarchy under Charles II, the penal laws were repealed, but shortly thereafter came things like the Act of Uniformity in 1662, and the Test Act of 1674, which again disenfranchised the Catholic public and required that anyone who served in government or in the church be required to swear allegiance to the Anglican Church. In 1690, you had the Williamite Wars between the Catholics and Protestants, the aftermath of which saw a gradual return to stricter penal laws. Tensions between the Catholics and the Protestants would be lessened somewhat after the rise of the Hanoverian dynasty and the death of the last Stuart heir, when the Pope officially recognized the legitimacy of the Hanoverian dynasty. But still, most folks at the time in Parliament were rich Anglicans of British ancestry. Then in 1798, hot on the heels of a successful American Revolution against the British and a successful French Revolution against their monarchs. A small group of Irish nationalists launched their own revolution. This revolution failed. It was quickly put down in a matter of 3 months, and then 3 years later, the Acts of Union of 1801 would officially abolish the Kingdom of Ireland, dissolve its parliament, and then would officially bring Ireland into the United Kingdom. Because of the easing of tensions between the Catholics and the Protestants, slowly but surely throughout the early 1800s, Catholics would experience gradual emancipation. They would have their right to hold office and serve in the United Kingdom Parliament restored. Social laws of persecution and discrimination were repealed. And then in the 1840s and 50s, you had the Great Famine. During this time, over 1 million Irish people would die, and another million would leave and come to America. This kicked off tensions again between the majority Catholics and the minority ruling class Protestants, and these tensions would start to formalize and crystallize an official Home Rule movement in the 1870s. The Nationalist Party established a Home Rule party in 1873. Around this time, too, you had the formation of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, which was a secret society of Irish nationalists, which infiltrated politics and civil service in Ireland. A Home Rule bill actually passed by the beginning of the war, but because World War I happened, it was never acted upon. This would lead to the Easter Rising. On the morning of April 24th in 1916, which was the Monday after Easter, a group of about 1,200 members of the Irish Volunteer Army and the Irish Citizen Army stormed several locations in central Dublin and set up blockades and declared the birth of an Irish Republic. There was a heavy British military presence in Dublin, but the siege caught them totally off guard. By the end of the day on that Monday, the rebels had seized several buildings and were prepared to defend those buildings from the British retaliation. But because the rebels had failed to get control of a couple of key railroads and a couple of ports along the River Liffey, by the end of the next day, Tuesday, thousands of British troops had entered Dublin and were preparing to retaliate. The British shipped in troops, artillery, machine guns, and then would even sail a gunboat right up the river into Dublin, and then for a couple days beginning on Wednesday, just shelled the hell out of the rebel positions. Despite being totally outnumbered, the rebels were able to hold their positions through the rest of the week, but were eventually subdued and surrendered. The principal parties responsible for the rebellion were executed, and further discord between the British and the Irish was sown that would eventually lead to the beginning of the official Irish War of Independence, and then would kick off a series of civil wars in Ireland, but between those Protestants who remained loyal to the British Crown and the Catholic majority that wanted the Brits gone for good. This would result in the split between Ireland and Northern Ireland. Ireland is now its own independent republic. Northern Ireland is still officially part of the United Kingdom. It's important to know the history of Ireland given the context of our studies, but it's also important to know because of the life of our feature poet today, William Butler Yeats, who was alive and working and saw his work dramatically affected by Irish nationalism, by the Easter Rising, and by the Irish Civil War. William Butler Yeats was the son of John Butler Yeats, who was a painter who was not particularly successful in his life, but has become revered posthumously. John Yeats gave up a career as a lawyer in order to pursue painting, which essentially landed them in poverty for most of their life. But the Yeats family was a member of the Protestant ascendancy, and so John Butler Yeats was able to sustain himself and his family primarily through just asking his extended family for money. Yeats's mother was a woman named Susan, who at an early age suffered a stroke and would become an invalid for most of her life. Yeats began writing poetry in his late teens. He was heavily influenced by the Romantics and the Pre-Raphaelites, but he was also highly influenced by Irish ancient history and Irish mythology and folklore. Because of his interest in Irish mythology, he had a lifelong interest in the occult and spiritualism, and these were things that frequently found their ways into his poetry in the first phase of his career. Yeats was a central figure in the Irish literary revival. Yeats himself never picked up a gun and participated in the military actions of Irish nationalists. Yeats's contribution to Irish nationalism was almost entirely literary. He was a founding member of the Irish Literary Revival. He helped found the Irish National Theatre, also known as the Abbey Theatre, and he founded several publications specifically to display the works of Irish writers and poets. Yeats was a member of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, but due to his status as a member of the Protestant ascendancy, he somewhat distanced himself prior to the Easter Rising. However, Yeats did maintain close friendships and relationships with several members of the Irish Republican Brotherhood throughout the Revolutionary period, probably most importantly with a woman named Maud Gonne, whom Yeats was in love with for most of his life, to whom he proposed marriage several times. Maud would eventually marry Major John McBride, who was a central figure in the Easter Rising. During the first phase of his career, career, Yeats would write poetry that primarily focuses on traditional Irish symbolism. He would invoke imagery of fairies and pagan creatures like wood nymphs and elves, and in a very romantic sense would invoke natural imagery of the Irish landscape, of dense forest glens and green hillsides, and invoking figures from Irish mythology. Yeats's poetry in the 1880s and 1890s was heavily symbolic, very lyrical, full of dense imagery and symbolism. Even at a young age, Yeats's poetry was morbid. He thought a lot about death and mortality and how one might achieve immortality through art. This is the man who dreamed of fairyland. He stood among a crowd at Drumahair. His heart hung all upon a silken dress, and he had known at last some tenderness before earth took him to her stony care. But when a man poured fish into a pile, it seemed they raised their little silver heads and sang what gold morning or evening sheds upon a woven world-forgotten isle, where people love beside the ravelled seas, that time can never mar a lover's vows. Under that woven changeless roof of boughs, the singing shook him out of his new ease. He wandered by the sands of Lissadell, his mind ran on money, cares, and fears, and he had known at last some prudent years before they heaped his grave under the hill. But while he passed before a plashy place, a lugworm with its grey and muddy mouth sang that somewhere to north or west or south there dwelt a gay, exulting, gentle race under the golden or the silver skies, that if a dancer stayed his hungry foot, it seemed the sun and moon were in the fruit, and at that singing he was no more wise. The Man Who Dreamed of Fairyland is essentially a poem and invokes an idea of men who get more and more preoccupied by the humdrum rat race of life, and that on their death are being told that there are better places, and these better places hearken not to heaven but to a world full of mystical figures. Then you have a poem like The Stolen Child, which uses the imagery of a child being stolen by fairies as a symbol for lost innocence in childhood. For he comes, the human child, to the waters and the wild, with a fairy hand in hand, from a world more full of weeping than he can understand. In a very romantic sense, these poems are about lifting up the mythos of the Irish people. Poems that are set in specific Irish locations and that speak to the rich tradition of Gaelic folklore that is the heritage of the Irish people. On into the 19th century, his poetry would become a little less fantastical and more rooted in social concerns. His love affair with Maud Gonne was something that always kept him on the periphery of the Irish nationalist movement, was something that always kept him on the periphery of the military side of the Irish nationalist movement. Frequently he would invoke imagery of the Trojan War to describe his relationship with Maud and the difficulty of his specific position as a Irish Protestant in the larger Irish nationalist movement. The middle period of Yeats's career centered around the Easter Rising and the Irish Revolution. He would immortalize those who were executed as rebels in his poem Easter 1916. In this poem, he talks specifically about the people that he knew. He described them as people that he would just pass in his daily life. The rebels who took part in the Easter Rising were not military people. They were teachers, they were shop owners, they were people that he would just pass along the street. These were normal people living their lives and taking on a cause that they felt was just and right. As he lists them, he talks about how he knows them. That woman's days were spent in ignorant goodwill, her nights in argument until her voice grew shrill. What voice more sweet than hers when young and beautiful rode to harriers? This man kept a school, rode our winged horse. This other, his helper and friend, was coming into his force. He might have won some fame in the end, so sensitive his nature seemed, so daring and sweet his thought. This other man I had dreamed a drunken, vainglorious lout. That was likely referring to Maud Gonne's husband. He had done most bitter wrong to some who are near my heart, yet I number him in the song. He too has resigned his part in the casual comedy. He too has been changed in his turn, transformed utterly, a terrible beauty born. It was not lost on Yeats the significance of the Easter Rebellion and of the centrality of the figures who took part in it in fomenting the Home Rule cause. And then there is The Second Coming, which is probably his most anthologized poem. This poem invokes imagery of the Second Coming of Christ, but it turns it on its head slightly and presents the dawning of a period that was altogether unexpected and not what people had in mind when they envisioned the Second Coming of Christ. The first stanza is an apocalyptic vision, turning and turning in the widening gyre. The falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the sinner cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. This is obviously invoking image of a society collapsing. A gyre is essentially a phrase that he coined and invented to talk about a spiral of society, things going round and round and round, but becoming more and more decentralized and more chaotic. It is a time where the worst people are the ones that seem to have sway in society, while the best are encouraged to keep quiet and keep their heads down. But of course, during a period like this, people are waiting for the end of the trouble and the dawning of a new day. And this is where the imagery of the second coming is invoked. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming, hardly are those words out when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in the sands or the deserts, a shape with a lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it reels shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle, and what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches toward Bethlehem to be born. What is being invoked here is the idea that the second coming that people were hoping for brought upon an unexpected result. It is not Christ that is coming back in this second coming. It is a beast. It is a large, lurking beast that is described as kind of like a sphinx that has been loosed upon the world, that has been waiting for something altogether different to come and save it from its troubles. This is in many ways an allegory for how Yeats saw the military action of the Irish Rebellion. People take up a cause that they think is just and are going to fight and lay down and die for this cause. And this is a process that will wreak great havoc and destruction upon the people in the hopes that something better lies on the other end. But the truth of the matter is, who knows what's going to happen? Who knows what we do today is going to result in down the line? We may pray for something today, but what we get further down the line might not look anything like what we wanted. And then in the third phase of his career, Yeats's poetry would become very preoccupied with mortality and dying and how to achieve immortality through art. There's a constant theme in his poems of uncertainty with regard to events and how those events will manifest themselves further on down the line. In his poem Leda and the Swan, he invokes an image out of Greek mythology in a story where Zeus transforms himself into a swan to seduce a woman named Leda. In his poem, Yeats's version of the story is much closer to a rape than to a seduction. The first words of the poem are, "A sudden blow, the great wings beating still above the staggering girl, her thighs caressed by the dark webs, her nape caught in his bill, he holds her helpless breast upon his breast. How can those terrified, vague fingers push the feathered glory from her loosening thighs? And how can body laid in that white rush but feel the strange heart beating where it lies? A shudder of the loins engenders there the broken wall, the burning roof and tower, and Agamemnon dead. Being so caught up, so mastered by the brute blood of the air, did she put on his knowledge with his power before the indifferent beak could let her drop." This is a poem built around the Greek myth that after Zeus's seduction of Leda in the form of a swan, she would then give birth to the progeny of people who would then carry on the Trojan War. The reference to the broken wall and to the death of Agamemnon speaks specifically to events that are described in the Trojan War. And so what this poem is basically about is how you can never really know for certain how you're going to take the experience of one event and use it to propel you into the future. We can never predict the chain reaction that can happen after a single event takes place. And then finally for today, you have Sailing to Byzantium, which again is a poem about a man who is growing old and is trying to achieve some sense of immortality through art. That is no country for old men, the young in one another's arms, birds in the trees, those dying generations at their song, the salmon falls, the mackerel crowded seas, fish, flesh, or fowl commend all summer long whatever is begotten, born, and dies. Caught in that central music, all neglect monuments of unaging intellect. An aged man is but a paltry thing, a tattered coat upon a stick, unless soul claps its hands and sing, and louder sings for every tatter in its mortal dress. Nor is there singing school but studying monuments of its own magnificence, and therefore I have sailed the seas and come to the holy city of Byzantium. O sages standing in God's holy fire, as in the gold mosaic of a wall, come from the holy fire, purn in a gyre, and be the singing masters of my soul. Consume my heart away, sick with desire, and fastened to a dying animal it knows not what it is, and gather me into the artifice of eternity. Once out of nature, I shall never take my bodily form from any natural thing, but such a form as Grecian goldsmiths make of hammered gold and gold enameling, to keep a drowsy emperor awake, or sit upon a golden bough to sing to lords and ladies of Byzantium of what is past or passing or to come. For his poetry, Yeats would win the Nobel Peace Prize in 1923. In the later portion of his life, Yeats would serve in the Irish Senate and would continue to operate as a key figure for the Irish nationalist sympathy. He died in 1939. I feel like even though I've somewhat failed at keeping this brief, I still haven't even touched upon the significance of Yeats and his position in British literature generally, in Irish literature specifically, in Irish culture, in Irish politics. I could go on and on forever. The history of Britain and Ireland is the history of Britain and the world. Britain feeling very confident in its right to just take whatever it wants, and in the end fomenting its own loss of control over those places that it feels entitled to, over those places and people that it feels entitled to own and oversee. I could go on and on, but we'll stop here. The lawnmowers are coming out, and pretty soon the sun will be in my eyes. I hope you enjoy your long Easter weekend. I hope you stay safe and healthy. I miss you. I love you. I'm sailing to Byzantium.